In this video, we're going to talk about how to create a basic menu system that will allow the user to choose which code that they would like to run. Now, I went ahead and started a new solution and just called it basic menu. And inside of our main, of course, we got rid of the hello world line, as we always do. And let's go ahead and start. Now, inside of our main, let's put a / and put create a menu. Now, the first thing about creating a menu is we have to create a variable that's going to allow us to keep it going. Now, the idea of this menu system is we're going to allow the user to choose either option 1 of running our first function, option 2 for running our second function, or pressing 3 to exit our program. So let's make a note of this. So we're going to allow the user to choose 1, 2, or 3 from our different options. And let's go ahead and list out our options. So option 1 is going to be to run our first function. So run function 1. Option 2 is going to be to run our function 2. And option 3 is going to exit our program. Now, we do want the user to be able to run multiple programs. So say the first time they run the first function, great. And then we're going to ask them, hey, what do you want to do again? Do you want to run function 1, 2, or exit? And then maybe they run function 2. And then we give them the option again, hey, do you want to run function 1, 2, or exit? And we're going to keep prompting them as long as they type in 1 or 2. And the only way for them to exit the program is to type in 3. Now, we need some sort of repeating code that's going to allow the user to keep choosing, right? And so if we think about repeating code, we only have a couple different choices. And in this case, we don't know how many times the user is going to want to run the program. So if we don't know the specific number of times, then that's going to be a while loop. Now, in order to keep this going, we're going to have to create a variable in order to test in our while loop. Now, this is going to be a little bit weird because we haven't really created a bool by itself. So we're going to create a Boolean variable to keep our loop going. So remember, Boolean variable, the data type is bool. Let's call this one keep menu going. And I'm going to set this to a Boolean of true. Okay. Now what we're going to do is we're going to create a while loop that will run as long as the user wants it to. So, aka chooses 1 or 2. I probably should put options. So choose options 1 or 2. Okay, so now we need a while loop. So while, open closing parentheses, and then hit return, open closing curly braces, and then hit a couple of spaces in between here. Now, inside of here, we need a test. Now, this is going to be a little unusual because we have this variable that already is a bool. Now, remember, inside the parentheses, we need a bool, right? So far, we've kind of went, is variable number less than 1, or is this equal to something else, right? But the outcome of that test is in fact going to be a bool. So we can just put this variable keep menu going, right? A lot of people when they're first starting out will say equal to true. But if you think about this, this is a test. Is the Boolean the same as true? Well, that's a Boolean of true, which is the same as the initial value of keep menu going. So this is redundant code and it's not really needed. Okay, so now we have our while loop that will run as long as the user wants it to. Okay, now inside of our while loop, the first thing we need to do is give the user the menu options. Now, if we're talking to the menu user, or we're talking to the user about the menu items, that's just going to be a console.writeLine, open closing, and a semicolon. And inside of here, a text string. And let's just give them some code or text that they know exactly what's going on and what we expect of them. So we're going to say, what code would you like to run? Okay, so that's our first question, right? Now, I'm going to go ahead and put in a console.writeLine. And actually, you know what I'm going to do? At the end of this one, I'm going to put a \r\n. Now remember, this is just a return key, so this will put this line of code and then press return, so it'll give us a nice little space in between these two lines of code. Now in the next console.writeLine, I'm going to give them the first option. So I'm going to give them another text string, so a set of double quotes, and inside of here, I'm going to put a parentheses and a 1, then a space, and I'm going to put the name of the code that I want to run, so function 1. Let's go ahead and do the same thing for function 2. Now, of course, when you're doing your menu items, you would still kind of use the numbers like this, but then you would put like which part of the code that they want to run. So homework, let's say number 2, or homework section check please, or something like that, right? So we're just using generic ones in our basic menu system first, so we kind of get the idea of it. And then in the next video, we'll go more in depth about this. So we have console.writeLine 2 and function 2. And finally, our last one, because we only have 3 options for our menu, as we show up here, is our console.writeLine, open closing parentheses and a semicolon. Inside of here, a set of double quotes. And we're going to say parentheses 3 and exit. All right. So if we just run this right now, this code will loop forever. And it's going to kind of give us a weird thing. Why? Because we're telling it to loop forever, right? Because we're saying run as long as this is true. Well, we set it to a true, and we never change the value. So we can't actually use this quite yet. But if I kind of hover over it for a minute and kind of like, you can see the menu is taking shape. Now I'm going to go ahead and crash that. There we go. Okay. So now we have the options for them. And then let's go ahead and tell the user to choose an option. So let's go ahead, and it's going to be another console.writeLine, open closing and a semicolon. Inside of here, a set of double quotes. And let's go ahead and tell them what they should do. So that is, please type in the number of the command you want to run. So of course, that's function 1, function 2. So they would type in the number associated with that of 1, 2, or 3. Now, if we're asking them to input something, what do we do next? Well, we have to create a variable and catch the user's response. So that can only be a string, so put string, then a space, menu option. We're going to set that equal to a console.readLine, open closing, and a semicolon. All right, so now at least we have to prompt the user for that menu option. Now, anytime we have a read line, what automatically comes next? Well, we have to validate the user prompt. Now, let's think about this. What kind of validation technique are we doing here? Well, we're having them type in specific answers, right? A 1, a 2, or a 3. And granted that they're numbers, but do we have to use them as numbers? That's kind of the key question here. Now, if we had to use them as numbers, then that would be if we're doing math with them, right? If we're prompting the user for a cost and we're multiplying it times 2 or something like that. But really, we're prompting them for the 1, 2, or 3 because it's easy for them to type in, but we don't really have to convert it because we're not doing math with that. We're just using it to test what code we should actually run. So we could just leave this as a string itself. Now, if we leave it as a string, then what kind of validation are we using? Now, a lot of students will answer is null or whitespace, right? Because that's what we've always used for strings. But it's not an open-ended question because is null or whitespace is only used for open-ended questions like what is your name or what is your favorite book? See, that user could type in anything, right? In this case, we're looking for specific answers of 1, 2, or 3, and anything else is going to be reprompted. So for this type of thing, we're going to have to use the not equal to validation method. Let's go ahead and see what that looks like. So of course, a validation, we have to use a while loop. Why? Because we don't know how many times the user is going to get this wrong. So we're going to put in a while, open closing parentheses, open closing curly braces, and split those apart. Let's type in our tests here. Okay, so we're using that not equal to, so what are we testing? Now, if we go back to our validation with while loops videos, this covers this in more depth. So if you have trouble with the not equal to validation, I recommend going back and checking out that video again. So we're going to do menu option, not equal to, and what are we doing? A text string of 1. Now, if we did want to convert this, we could use a try parse, and then we could do a number range to only allow in 1 to 3, which is completely acceptable, but this is kind of a simpler way of doing it as well. So either which way is going to work. So menu option, not equal to a text string of 1. Now we're going to add in multiple tests here, so that means we need an and. Then what's our next test? Is the menu option not equal to a text string of 2. And finally an and. Menu option, oops, if I could have hit that, give me 1 second, let me back up. All right, menu option, not equal to a text string of 3. So those are the only valid responses is 1, 2, and 3. So if the user types in anything other than 1, 2, or 3, then this while loop will actually function. Okay, so let's give them the error message. So that's going to be a console.writeLine. Open closing and a semicolon. Inside of here, a set of double quotes. We'll start with the \r\n just to give a nice little return line. And please only type in 1, 2, or 3. Now, this is where we repeat the question. So that's going to be another console.writeLine. Open closing and a semicolon. Inside of here, set of double quotes. And we're going to say, which set of code would you like to run? Finally, the last part of that validation is recatching the user's response. Now remember, for this, we have to use the same variable as we're testing up here, and we have already created it, so that is just menu option equal to a console.readLine, open closing, and a semicolon. Now this will force the user to only type in 1, 2, or 3, and everything else will be reprompted. Now we can go ahead and run this, and it's going to still be that never-ending loop, but since we have a read line, it will actually stop for a moment before just kind of continuing to cycle. So that's okay for now, because we just want to see kind of how it works. So what code would you like to run? 1, 2, 3. So if I type in cat, it's going to say, nope, you have to type in 1, 2, or 3. How about the number 4? Nope, that's not valid. How about if I spell out the number 2? Nope, not good. And when I press a valid answer, such as 2, then it will loop. Okay, so this is it looping back over and starting up here, asking us our initial question again, because that is a valid answer. All right, so I didn't actually include any code about how to exit, so I'm going to have to kill this off by terminating it. And we can continue forming our method for our menus. Okay, now we have a user prompt with the code that they actually want to run. Now what do we do with it? Well, we need to create a conditional to deal with the menu choices. So think about it. If the user types in 1, then run this code. Else if the user types in 2, then run this code. Else if the user types in 3, stop our code. So that's going to be our conditionals to think about it in English terms. So a conditional always starts with an if statement, an open and closing parentheses, and an open closing curly braces, and split those apart. Let's go inside of our if statement. And what are we testing here? Well, we're testing if the menu option wants to run the first one. So what would they have to type in is that text string of 1. So we're saying, is the menu option the same as a text string of 1? All right. So inside of here, let's just put a console.writeLine for a moment and put a text string of go run the first function. All right. Let's go ahead and fill in our next one, which is going to be our else if statement, open closing parentheses and open closing curly braces, and split those apart. Else if what? Let me go ahead and put this on a separate line because it might make it a little bit easier to read. and the computer doesn't mind. So else if, well, what happens if they type in the number 2? So that's a menu option equal to a text string of 2. All right. Well, in this case, what are we going to do? Just run another console.writeLine and go run the second function. And finally, we have our last one, which is going to be our option number 3. Now, we have a couple different options for our conditionals. I could either type in else, because if they don't type in 1 and they don't type in 2, this validation says the only thing that they could possibly be left is 3, right? Because if it was 4 or 5, they would never make it out of the while loop validation up here. So we don't really have to test for that third one down here, but we could as well. So it doesn't really matter. Either way is correct. Personally, for me, I like putting the else if, open closing parentheses, and then there's open and closing curly braces and split those apart. I'm going to go ahead and put that else if on that next line down as well. For my test, it's going to be menu option equal text string of 3. And inside of here, what do we have to do? Well, we have to do a console writeLine, and we'll just say \r\n. Thank you for using my program. This is just going to be some kind of like text so the user sees something when the program ends instead of it just going boop and closing, right? We want to think about the user experience as much as possible. So another console.writeLine, text string, we'll just say \r\n, goodbye. And then how do we actually stop the program from running? Now we have to think about this. How do we stop this? What is actually continuing to make this loop run? Well, it's this keep menu going. And the while loop will run as long as this is true. It will stop when this is a Boolean of false. So how do we get it to be false? Well, we just set it to be false. So now we set the variable that keeps the menu going to a bool of false. And that will stop the actual menu. So menu option, not menu option. It's called keep menu going equal to a Boolean of false. And this will only happen if the user types in 3. And why would they do that? To exit the program. Okay, so we do need a couple more things down here, but we'll show you them in just a second. So let's test this before we do anything else. Here we go. We're going to test our code. If we type in test, that's not a 1, 2, or 3. How about 1? All right, so it says go run the first function, and then it asks again, what code would you like to run? And we're staying inside the menu because they chose a valid answer, we did the first thing, and now we're saying, what else do you want to do? Well, how about if we type in the number 2? It ran the number 2, so it ran the conditional statement right here, right? We skip over the else if statement, because remember, only one conditional block can run, so either the if or the else if or the else if, but the first one to meet that criteria runs. Then we reprompt, so we start the menu again. And this will continue as long as the user types in 1 or 2. If they type in something like cat, the validation will catch it and says, only type in 1, 2, or 3. And this will go on for as long as the user wants it to. When they want it to end, they'll type in the number 3. You get your goodbye message of thank you for using my program, goodbye, and then press any key to continue, which will close the program. So that's the basic idea of it. Now, in order to make it a little bit more user-friendly to read, every time this loops, it gets a little muddled, right? Because we don't really want this to stick around the whole entire time. So the way to reset that is to add in a couple things here at the bottom. Now this is outside of our conditionals, but still inside of our while loop. So we're going to add in this code to make the menu more user-friendly. The first thing I want to do is just add in a pause, right? So we're going to pause the menu and let the user hit enter. So the easiest way to do that is just to use a console.readLine open, closing, and a semicolon. Now remember, we always did this, and we always set a string equal to it to catch it. But if I just want to stop for a minute and let the user hit enter, this is what this looks like. So if I hit 2, go run the second function, and notice it pauses there until the user types in any key and then hits return. And then it just relaunches the menu again, okay? Which is okay, because we just want it to be a little bit of a break for the user to type in something, right? We could actually give them a little bit more. So maybe a pause. We could say console.readLine, not readline, sorry about that. A console.writeLine, open, closing, and a semicolon. Inside of here, let's put a \r/\n. Press enter to continue. Let's go ahead and run it again. We have to choose a valid one first, so like a 1. And then it says press enter to continue. And then it will loop. But we still have this menu that's kind of never ending and kind of will just continue onwards, which is a little annoying. So what we're going to do is we're going to use something new, and this is part of the console class. So we're going to clear the terminal of all text. And the way we do that is by using the console.clear method and open and closing parentheses. Now nothing inside of there. All this does is when it runs, it will clear the whole terminal. So let's see what that looks like. When I type in a valid answer like 1, it says, hey, go run the first function, press enter to continue. And what happened? Well, it completely deleted everything on the screen, and then it started the loop over again, and the first thing in the loop is to re-put the menu back out, which is why the menu persists. How about if they hit 2? All right, so notice when I press return, it then clears the whole thing down here. It comes to the closing curly brace, bounces right back up to the first one, says, should I continue? I never change it, so yes. Then it outputs the menu again. And that's the great way of putting it on there. So then we can, it makes it much easier for the actual user to read. All right, so we are getting along. Now, the next thing we have to do is actually put in some functions here to hold our code. Now, this is going to be some basic functions that we learned about in previous videos as well. So we need some functions. So let's come outside of our main. So that's this closing curly brace. I'm going to press return after it a couple times, making sure that I'm still in my class and I'm still in my namespace. Okay, so these should be here. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a basic function. So that starts with a public, static. I don't really want this to return anything to our main, so I'm going to leave this as a return of void. Remember, void is nothing. It's the absence of anything. So that's what we're returning as nothing. And I'm just going to call this one function 1, open and closing parentheses, and an open and closing curly braces. Now, this is where your parameters would go, but in this example, I'm just starting my code down here, so I'm not going to pass in anything either. So this is going to be blank. Now, inside of here, I can have any code I want, but because this is just a basic one, I'm just going to put a console.writeLine and say, this text is inside of the function 1. That's it. And remember, I don't need a return value because I'm not returning anything because that's void. Now, what do I do with this? Well, I'm going to come back up inside of my conditional where if the user chooses 1, then I want to run this function. So function call to our function 1. What does a function call look like? Well, it's just the name of the function, an open and closing parentheses, and a semicolon. Now, I'm not setting it equal to anything because I'm returning void, which means it's not returning anything, and I'm not sending anything into it, so this is a blank for the arguments as well. I'm going to go ahead and create the second function. So I'm going to come down here after my first ones and my closing bracket of my first function, but still inside my class and my namespace. And I'm going to put public, static, void, function 2, open and closing parentheses, open, closing, curly braces, and split that apart. Inside of here, I'm just going to go ahead and put some basic stuff. console.writeLine, open, closing, and a semicolon. And this text is inside of the function 2. Where do I run this at? Well, if the user chooses 2, they want to run our function 2, right? So we have to come inside of this else if statement. I'm going to come after my write line, and I'm going to call it. So function 2, open, closing parentheses. Same thing as our function number 1 up here. And that's going to be it for our basic menu system. Let's go ahead and run it. All right, we already know the validation works, so if they type in cat, it says nope. How about test? Nope. How about 1 for our function number 1? Go run the first function. This text is inside of function number 1. So what is it doing? It's first putting this console.writeLine onto the terminal, which is go run the first function, right? Then we have our function call, so we jump down to our first function, which just says this text is inside of function number 1. We hit the closing curly brace, which comes back up here to where we actually called it. Then we hit our closing curly brace. We skip the else if and else if statements. We come to these console write line, which puts press enter to continue. We have our read line, which waits for the user to type in a return. And then we have the clear, which resets our menu. What happens if they choose 2? Go run the second function. That's the write line inside of my conditional. This text is inside of the function 2, which is going to be all the way down here in our custom function number 2. We have our press enter to continue, pressed it, and it resets. And it will continue to do this for as long as the user wants. So they can run function 1, run function 2, run function 1, so on and so on, until they press 3, which closes our program completely. Now in our next video, we're going to use a kind of bigger example, which is going to use other functions that these functions can call and actually make our code much more usable, let's say that. But this is the basics of creating a menu system with functions.